Distinguished participants, it is my great honor and pleasure to moderate this first panel, which will explore the nature and scale of the problem of human trafficking and discuss why strong leadership is necessary to overcome the challenges. The panel will also explore gaps in responses by states across the OSCE region and the consequences of these gaps. We have several distinguished speakers, some of whom will be online, leaders in the areas in which they have been working. And I will introduce each of them in turn. Using my privilege as a moderator, I just want to start by saying a few words. Obviously, leadership in combating human trafficking can take place and takes place at many levels, both individually and collectively. Action against this scourge has been championed by leading individuals, politicians championing groundbreaking legislation such as the Modern Slavery Act, parliamentarians holding governments to account, civil society organizations and lawyers pushing for better protection of victims' rights, judges creating case law. The list is very long, and there are many inspiring examples of such leadership. Some of these leaders are present at this conference today. I want to say a few words about collective leadership, using as an example the organization, the Council of Europe, which I have been working for 28 years. And I'm proud to say that the Council of Europe, being the leading human rights organization of the European continent, has been actively engaged in combating human trafficking in its member states and beyond, in partnership with other international organizations, notably the OSCE and the European Union, as well as very closely with civil society. Back in 2002, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe called on the Committee of Ministers of the organization to elaborate a new convention on combating trafficking in human beings. And this proposal was taken up. In 2003, the drafting of the convention started. It took 2 years, and it was not devoid of controversies. Many of its groundbreaking features became possible only due to consistent pressure by leading individuals from the Parliamentary Assembly, as well as from civil society organizations. So this leadership was crucial to finalize the preparation of the convention and to enable its entry into force. Today, the convention has 48 state parties, including 47 OSCE participating states and 1 OSCE partner for cooperation. The convention has been praised as embodying a revolutionary way of thinking about human trafficking, being the first international legal instrument which placed the protection of victims at the center of the fight against human trafficking. It became thus a major breakthrough for human rights, which we are very proud of. The convention, as you know, provides for a series of rights for victims of human trafficking, in particular the right to be identified as a victim, irrespective of willingness or possibility to cooperate with the criminal justice, to receive protection and assistance according to the needs, as well as compensation for the damages suffered. Particularly innovative provision of the convention is the non-punishment principle. Another important feature of the Council of Europe Anti-Trafficking Convention is the setting up of an independent monitoring mechanism, the Group of Experts on Action Against Human Trafficking, known by the acronym of GRETA, which clarifies the substantive content of the obligations under the convention and drives for action. Having been the executive secretary of GRETA for the last 12 years, at a critical time when the first evaluations by GRETA started, I have directly witnessed the evolution of national efforts to ensure compliance with the convention. Unfortunately, I have also seen over the years worrying signs of undermining what has been achieved. The country-by-country reports drawn up by GRETA provide a comprehensive picture of trends in human trafficking, positive practices, and challenges in each party to the convention. A recently published report of the internal independent evaluation of the Council of Europe thematic area of human trafficking assessed both what changes were observed and why they have been achieved. According to this independent evaluation report, there is unequivocal evidence that monitoring has contributed to increasing state parties' compliance with the convention, prompting changes to legislation, policies, and practice. Monitoring activities during the period 2016-2021 contributed to triggering 46 changes in legislation, 38 at policy level, and 76 in practice. I dare say that the monitoring work of Greta is thus an integral contributing factor to legislative and policy change, alongside pressure from other international organizations and civil society. The Council of Europe's work has also been leading in other areas. In particular, we pioneered back in 2007 a study on the misuse of internet for the recruitment of victims, and a couple of years ago released new research on the online and technology facilitated trafficking in human beings. And another area where the Council of Europe has reviewed its argument is in the area of combating trafficking for the purpose of labor exploitation, where the Committee of Ministers issued a new recommendation last year. So with this introduction, which for me was important as an example of collective leadership at international level, although I know the conference is about national leadership, I would like to start by introducing the first speaker, who will be joining us online. And I hope that he is already online. I would like to say a few words about Gary Haugen, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the International Justice Mission. So you have his bio there, but I will just say a few words because Gary has been active in this area of combating human trafficking for many years. Prior to that, he focused on work as a human rights attorney for the US Department of Justice. And I understand that he was also serving as the director of the United Nations investigation in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide. And very importantly, he was awarded the Trafficking in Persons Hero Award in 2012 by the US government for anti-slavery leadership. So if Gary is online, I would like to invite him to take the floor.
Thank you for your kind introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. And as we focus on leadership today, and as you mentioned, collective leadership today, let me begin by thanking Mr. Ritchie and the team at the OSCE for their leadership in gathering us today. Congratulations to the OSCE on being for 20 years, one of the leading organizations in this fight, because I can personally testify that 25 years ago when IJM entered the struggle, there almost was no awareness of human trafficking outside some very small pockets of expertise and activism. But today, thanks to the leadership of the OSCE and the agencies in this room, the landscape is completely changed when it comes to broad global awareness, significant research and data, and models of government practice and system response. We could also say, though, after more than 2 decades of hard work and increasing investment, 2 things will be evident to this knowledgeable audience. First, global rates of trafficking in persons remain stubbornly high in the tens of millions. And second, global case data shows that formal justice system responses through victim identification and trafficker arrests and convictions are declining. I'm referring, of course, to the ILO's most recent global estimates of modern slavery and the UNODC's latest global report on trafficking in persons cases. Now, of course, there is a simple truth connecting these 2 trends, and that's this, that there is no trafficking without the trafficker. Trafficking still exists on a massive scale today because there are huge swaths of our world where there's little to no chance of getting in trouble for being a trafficker. We should and can do powerful things to reduce the vulnerability of victims. But for this particular crime, the thing that states alone can do that has a singular impact on traffickers is to deter the traffickers. States, therefore, must understand what does deter traffickers, and then states should do those things. Specifically, this means states doing 2 things: enforcing trafficking laws effectively and providing excellent services to survivors. Because when states do this, the impact is spectacular. In fact, the global trend is reversed. When formal justice system responses improve, slavery rates rapidly and significantly decline. In fact, on 8 occasions documented over the last decade, we have seen that when governments in low and middle income countries have partnered with IJM in applying our justice system strengthening methodology, we have decreased trafficking in persons by 70 to 85% in 4 to 8 years. And this has been measured by third-party evaluations. So the secret to this progress can be pretty simply stated. Human trafficking is uniquely sensitive to the power of deterrence. Now, why is that? Quite simply because, as we empirically can now know, the vast majority of traffickers are highly opportunistic criminals. Of course, one can find a relatively small number of traffickers that are highly committed, but after 25 years of working tens of thousands of trafficking cases at IJM, here's the assurance that the data now confidently provides. The overwhelming majority of trafficking is soft crime, and it goes away as soon as traffickers run into a credible risk of going to jail. So, what matters to a trafficker is how likely it is that the law will be enforced against them. And when laws are enforced in a jurisdiction that reaches a threshold of consistency and frequency, the risk for the vast majority of traffickers becomes intolerable, and they simply exit the business, and trafficking rates begin to collapse. IJM project evaluations suggest that 70 to 85% of trafficking is committed by these opportunistic, highly deterrable offenders. It goes away when the law is enforced. Of course, legislative reform will always be important. Trafficking laws can and should be improved in multiple ways. But what matters to traffickers who are assessing their risk is how the law is actually enforced and applied on the ground. States effectively deter traffickers when they focus on increasing the consistency and frequency of formal victim identification and trafficker arrests and convictions. Now, obviously, there are many challenges to achieving that consistency and frequency of enforcement. Traffickers themselves seek to undermine the enforcement of trafficking laws in a variety of ways, but these challenges can be met. So first of all, traffickers threaten survivors to stop them from engaging with law enforcement. But if the state provides consistent and responsive support to survivors as they engage the criminal justice process, it greatly increases their safety and enables their ongoing participation. Secondly, traffickers operate across national borders. They rely on jurisdictional hurdles to slow down justice system responses. But NGOs like IJM and intergovernmental organizations and bodies like the OSCE can bridge multiple justice systems and enable swift case collaboration. Thirdly, traffickers are using online tools to commit their crimes and to hide their operations. But technology and open source intelligence capacities can enable law enforcement to rapidly locate victims and build evidence against suspects. Now, perhaps most importantly, we've also learned that law enforcement will remain ineffective, no matter how technically proficient, if laws are not enforced alongside excellent survivor services. Because, of course, in fact, the two are inextricably bound together. Survivors have an understandable distrust in systems that fail to regularly identify victims or fail to provide services for their recovery and restoration. Victims who do engage justice systems often feel they are simply being used to secure prosecutions without regard to their well-being. And so a major disconnect often exists between people experiencing trafficking and the justice systems that are meant to help them. And yet what is also true is that many of the survivors of trafficking are deeply invested in deterrence and accountability for traffickers. One survivor leader we were talking with just this week, named Kumar, he put it this way. He said, traffickers just care about profit and they don't think about people's pain. But when police arrest people operating with traffickers, those business owners changed their practices. Or to quote a survivor leader from the Global Survivor Network, Victoria Nyambura, she said, "For survivors, there is no dignity without accountability." The survivors we work with on a daily basis aren't interested in solutions that ignore the humans who exploited them. So how do we bridge this divide? Survivor leaders emphasize to us the need for justice officials to be knowledgeable about the effects of trauma on victims of trafficking and for officials to shape their responses accordingly. I'm sure everyone here agrees with that principle, yet it is striking to see many states and enforcement agencies still failing to fully recognize the importance of trauma-informed responses. The truth is, responses that are truly trauma-informed, that deliver excellent survivor services, actually break the barriers of distrust between those who are experiencing trafficking and the government duty bearers who are responsible for assisting them and enforcing their laws against the traffickers. Time and again, we have seen that as justice systems become more victim-centered and trauma-informed, the usual distrust and distance is removed, and a bridge is built to vulnerable populations. Survivors, of course, themselves take the lead in bridging that divide. For example, the Released Bonded Laborers Association in South Asia. It's a group of thousands of survivors of bonded labor. The RBLA now plays a critical role in not only advocating for more victim-centered and trauma-informed government responses, but also in supporting those who are trapped in bondage to engage the state authorities for help and assistance. At IJM, we have witnessed the power of survivor leadership as we've helped catalyze the Global Survivor Network to bring the voice and leadership of thousands of survivors into the anti-trafficking fight around the world. They play the primary role in advocating for states to uphold this singular responsibility that is alone the responsibility of the state, to enforce the law and provide excellent services to survivors. What we all appreciate in this room is that human trafficking is a complex, multifaceted crime and a severe violation of human rights. And the member states of the OSCE have the opportunity to lead the world in drastically reducing trafficking by deterring traffickers and providing excellent services to survivors. And of course, IJM and our partners, and I think all of us in this room, are willing allies in that path. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Gary, for your presentation, for really putting the spotlight on the need for accountability. The quote that you mentioned from a survivor, "There's no dignity without accountability. There's no success in fighting human trafficking without accountability." And really mentioning the two essential ingredients, enforcement and services for survivors. The two are linked. Providing excellent survivor services depends, of course, on identification and on the right of victims to remain in a country, to have a residence permit, to be provided with services. And of course, we see that there's a lot of tension around this in many countries. I would like now to introduce the second speaker, who will also be joining us online. Laila Mickelwait, who has been working in the area of combating injustice of sex trafficking for over 15 years. And Laila is the founder and chief executive officer of the Justice Defense Fund. Very importantly, she has been leading efforts to hold accountable the 10th most visited website in the world, and the largest pornography website in the world, holding it accountable for enabling and profiting from sex trafficking and exploitation of victims, known as the Trafficking Hub movement. And I suppose Laila will be telling us about the leading efforts of her organization in this respect. So Laila, please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for having me. I'd love to share my screen with you today. Can we make that happen? Let's see. Trying to share screen. There we go. Okay, good. All right. Thank you again for having me. Today I am going to share and highlight for you a case study. And this is a case study about a modern manifestation of online sex trafficking, a mega trafficker that has shattered the lives of countless victims around the world. I'm going to tell you about some encouraging successes that we have had in this fight, but I'm also going to share with you some very concerning failures of corporate and government leadership. And these are failures that must be addressed not only for this fight, but for our collective anti-trafficking movement to be effective. So I'm going to tell you a story about Pornhub. Pornhub was the largest and most popular porn site in the world, the 10th most visited website across the internet, with more views than Netflix, Amazon, and Yahoo. Pornhub had 130 million visits per day, 47 billion visits per year, and enough content uploaded every 12 months that it would take 169 years to watch if you watch those videos back to back. Researchers named Pornhub the third most influential tech company on global society, just behind Facebook and Google. This is the world's YouTube of porn. This is user-generated content, meaning that anyone with a camera or an iPhone can become a pornographer, can film a sex act and upload it to the world's most popular porn site. And what I discovered when I tested that upload system in early 2020 was that Pornhub refused to verify the age or the ID of the millions of people who were featured in those videos, to verify that these are not children being raped and abused. They refused to verify consent, to ensure that these are not rape or trafficking victims being assaulted for profit. And because of that, Pornhub became infested with videos of real sexual crime, like the 15-year-old girl who was missing for an entire year from Florida. And she was found in 58 videos being raped for profit, where Pornhub was earning 35% of the sale of her rape videos. Or the 12-year-old boy from Alabama who was being drugged and overpowered and raped repeatedly. Those rapes were being filmed, and then they were being sold on Pornhub between $5 and $20 a piece to over 5 million users per hour on the site. Again, Pornhub earning 35% of the profit. Or the notorious Girls Do Porn sex trafficking operation that was a popular partner channel of Pornhub with over 600,000 subscribers, where dozens of women were being coerced, defrauded, and forced into sex acts that were being monetized on the site. And because of all of this, I have said often that Pornhub is not just a porn site, it's a crime scene. And I felt compelled to launch an effort to hold this site accountable. And that was the Trafficking Hub movement that started in 2020. Over 600 organizations joined together in this fight. Hundreds of survivors raised their voices. And today we have over 200 million views on victim stories and videos. 2.3 million people have signed the petition, the Trafficking Hub petition, to shut down Pornhub and hold its executives accountable from 192 countries, and thousands of media articles have been written highlighting this problem around the world. The most important of those articles was the New York Times piece called "The Children of Pornhub" that highlighted story after story of children who were raped and trafficked on the site for profit. Days after that happened, Pornhub deleted 10 million videos. 80% of the entire site was gone in 24 hours. Financial Times called it one of the biggest takedowns of content in internet history. Shortly after that, Visa and MasterCard and Discover actually cut ties with the site, leaving them only with cryptocurrency as a payment option. They lost nearly all major business partners and advertisers. And lawsuits were filed across the US and Canada. 8 lawsuits on behalf of 194 victims were filed, and the damages for these victims could total in the billions of dollars. Corporate policy was introduced. MasterCard, for example, introduced a global policy that disallowed the use of its card on any user-generated porn site that did not verify the age and the unambiguous consent of every individual in every video on those sites. Legislation was introduced. Senators and members of Congress had kudos and headlines for introducing legislation. A Canadian parliamentary hearing was launched. And after this, calls for criminal investigations came not only from Canada, but also the United States. In Canada, 70 members of parliament came together from 8 parties demanding a criminal investigation of the site and its owners. The CEO and the COO resigned, and the company and the website was sold. So these are successes, but what are the challenges? Let's revisit some of those things that I just talked about. So Pornhub today is still one of the most visited websites across the internet with billions of visits per year. They still refuse to verify the ID and the age of those in the videos. They still refuse to verify the consent of the individuals who are in the videos. Pornhub today, this moment, this very minute, is still a crime scene. Yes, they lost most all major business partners, but there's still thousands of businesses that are advertising on 4.6 billion ad impressions on that site every day. Visa, MasterCard, and Discover did cut ties after that big New York Times piece, but I found out from a senior level employee that weeks after that, they actually quietly went back to Pornhub, not to their public-facing transactions, but to the most lucrative monetization piece of that site, which is advertising. 60% of revenue comes from advertising. They went back to Pornhub. It took 2 years to actually finally get them to cut all ties with Pornhub. And that only came after a federal judge kept Visa in a case launched by a child trafficking victim of Pornhub who was suing Visa for monetizing their abuse. The corporate policy that I mentioned to you by MasterCard lost its teeth just weeks before implementation. They actually decided that they were going to go with the honor system for user-generated porn, where they were only going to require the uploader to be verified, not the individuals in the videos. But it's worth noting that that 12-year-old boy I mentioned from Alabama, whose rapes were monetized on Pornhub, those rapes were uploaded by a verified uploader. The 15-year-old girl who was missing for a year, her rapes were uploaded by a verified uploader. It is simply not enough to require uploaders to be verified. This legislation that was introduced has yet to be passed. We're still waiting for that legislation, and we're still waiting to see the criminal indictment against Pornhub. So what is the kind of conclusion here? Well, what I think I want to highlight for us all is, going off what Gary said, is we need to end impunity. Yes, for individual traffickers, but for corporate mega traffickers that are benefiting financially from the exploitation of countless victims around the world. We need to make the risks for these companies and their enablers greater than the benefits that they get by maintaining the status quo. That means civil litigation. We need to empower victims and survivors who want to pursue justice, to engage in civil litigation, to hit these companies where it hurts, in their wallet. We need the criminal prosecutions. We need to see government and corporate policy, Visa, MasterCard, and Discover, and PayPal saying we will not do business with user-generated porn sites that do not verify the age and the consent of every individual in every video. Again, it's so important. We must increase that risk. We must decrease the profitability. And when we do that, I think we're going to see some important progress in the fight against trafficking globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laila, for sharing with us this really impressive example of strong leadership, real mobilization, really impressive results. And again, the challenges that you mentioned, the impunity which continues. Clearly, engaging governments engaging to fight against this impunity when it concerns major corporations is key. I know that tomorrow one of the side events will be looking at the leadership which is necessary in order to hold businesses accountable for human trafficking. How to increase the risk and decrease the profitability. This is the key question that you put across. And empowering survivors through providing them with legal assistance, enabling them to access compensation. This is where we need to be really putting our efforts. I would now turn to the third speaker who is with us today physically. And I would like to introduce to you Nick Grono, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Freedom Fund. Nick is an Australian lawyer who served as a Chief of Staff and National Security Advisor to the Australian Attorney General for a number of years. And you have actually his bio on the screen. I'm not going to read all of it, but of course, he's also very well known because of the Walk Free Foundation. And we have been following over the years with great interest the estimates that have been produced on modern slavery. So Nick, you have the floor now to talk about the important work that you have been doing.
Well, thanks, Petya. It's my joy to follow two quite compelling speakers, so you'll have to bear with me. But as Petya said, at least you get me in person. I'm going to take a slightly different tack from Laila. Laila gave a compelling presentation about the horrors of commercial sex trafficking, utterly horrendous and far too prevalent crime. It's also a crime that, to be honest, gets a lot of the attention in this space, sometimes to the extent that other forms of trafficking are overlooked. And let's bear in mind, we've heard some of the numbers being quoted. The vast bulk of trafficking is forms of exploitation outside the commercial sexual exploitation, so it also merits attention, is also utterly horrific for those that are exploited. This was brought home to me when I first had my kind of first-hand encounter with trafficking exploitation about 16 years ago. I was in northern Uganda meeting with former rebel leaders of the Lord's Resistance Army and their victims. And I'm sure you're all familiar with some of the horrors of that conflict, but the Lord's Resistance Army used to raid villages, kidnap children, force them to execute their parents as a way of alienating them from their communities, enslave the boys as child soldiers, enslave the girls as porters and sex slaves. Utterly horrendous forms of exploitation. So when I started formally working in the anti-trafficking space, first as the CEO of the Walk Free Foundation, and then 10 years ago as the founder and CEO of the Freedom Fund, I wanted to ensure that we always had a focus on the many forms of exploitation. And what I want to do briefly here is just reflect on some of the lessons that I've learned over the last decade. I think we've seen very significant changes in the anti-trafficking space over the last decade, with implications for leadership in the anti-trafficking space. And I want to talk about changes to our understanding about the scale of the problem. I want to talk about changes to our understanding to the nature of the nature of trafficking. And then finally, changes in our understanding of the responses and leadership that's required. So let me start with scale. We've heard numbers. Numbers are critically important here. When I started 10 years ago, this was a number-free zone, right? And it's very hard to drive effective policy change if you don't understand your starting point and where you end up. So at the Walk Free Foundation, we published the first global slavery index. The data was necessarily weak, but we thought we need to start measuring. The number then was 30 million people in modern slavery, which we defined as incorporating forced labor and trafficking into forced marriage. 10 years later, in the latest estimates, which are now produced by Walk Free Foundation with the International Labour Organization and the International Organization of Migration, the number's 50 million, a significant increase. One of the huge challenges is we don't know if those numbers reflect an increase in trafficking or if they just reflect better measurement, because slavery is a hidden crime and we're much better at measuring it now. We're still not very good at tracking directions and trends. And again, that makes it very, very difficult for the policymakers in this room to understand the nature of our work and the impact it's having. We need to get much better at understanding all of those facts. If you look at forced labor numbers alone, the numbers from the ILO 10 years ago were 21 million in forced labor, now 28 million. So huge increases with a limited understanding of the drivers of those increases. I believe, of course, that things like COVID and the mass migration that we're seeing are big drivers of increases, but we just don't have the data yet. When it comes to profits, Valiant was talking about the $150 billion number. That's the estimated annual profits made from slavery and trafficking. That number dates back to 2014 and was based on a forced labor figure of 21 million. So if you accept the current figures of 28 million, we're talking over a couple of $100 billion in profits every year. And that's before we do more robust research into those numbers. And there will be a study coming out very soon that updates those figures. And I suspect we'll see a dramatic increase in the profits that are being made from slavery. So that's all pretty negative. I mean, the only bright spot when it comes to measurement is there's been a massive investment in actual measurement over the last decade. As I said, Walk Free leading on the global slavery estimate with ILO and IOM, but also national and subnational prevalence studies. And my organization, the Freedom Fund, has funded about 12 prevalence studies over the last decade. IJM, you heard Gary, has funded 8 or so prevalence studies. The Global Fund, represented here today by Sophie, has funded another dozen or so. And the US Trafficking in Persons Office has put huge funding into increasing the number of prevalence studies. So we're starting to get a better picture, but it's something every government here should be investing in. You should know how many people are being trafficked and in forced labor in your country. And it will make a huge difference if you invest the resources in measuring that so that we can know whether or not we're making progress over time. So that's the scale, our understanding scale. Our understanding of the nature of trafficking has changed, certainly in the last decade since I've been involved. I mean, 2 decades ago with the Palermo Protocol, the overwhelming focus was on commercial sex trafficking. And it reflects a strong interest in that sector overall. And certainly civil society leadership over the last couple of decades has been predominantly focused on that. That leads to a very strong focus on the sex industry, often a focus on the industry and not specifically on trafficking, which can be confusing when it comes to issues around identifying victims and supporting them and measuring. And when we look at the numbers and the data that we do have, as I mentioned earlier, you know, the 50 million estimated to be in slavery today, it's estimated that 6.3 million are in forced commercial sexual exploitation. That's 12.6% of the overall slavery numbers. If you look at that as the percentage of the number of people estimated to be in forced labor, it's about 23%. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done on many, many other equally horrendous areas of trafficking. And I often think about the child soldiers, the porters, the people I meet that have been enslaved on fishing boats, pumped full of amphetamines to provide the fish that we eat, kids working in the coltan mines to provide the minerals that power our mobile phones, children being forced to work in West Africa to produce coffee and cocoa, and the many other forms of exploitation that have horrendous effects on the victims. So one of the very pleasing trends over the last decade has been a much stronger focus on forced labor in supply chains. I want to commend Prime Minister Theresa May with their modern slavery legislation and focus on transparency in supply chains has certainly driven a stronger focus. And if we're looking for positive stories, I think over the next decade, we're going to see a lot of really strong action and regulation around attacking and addressing forced labor in supply chains. We are seeing developments with the EU directive that we hope is forthcoming on mandatory human rights due diligence. We're seeing really effective import bans in the US. We're seeing proposals for import bans in the EU. This can have a big impact on trafficking in supply chains because it affects the cost-benefit equation of the traffickers. And then finally, I just want to talk very briefly about our understanding of the most effective responses and leadership approaches that I've seen over the last decade. There's been a big and important, so in the past, the focus has been very heavily on law enforcement and raid and rescue. And deterrence is critically important. Law enforcement is critically important. But it just doesn't address the vulnerabilities that drive trafficking in the first place. And I think over the last decade, we've seen a greater awareness of that. It's not an either-or scenario. It's not you do deterrence and you don't invest in communities and addressing vulnerabilities and prevention. It should be a both approach. We should continue a laser-like focus on deterrence, but we need to get a lot more sophisticated about our understanding of the drivers of slavery and the vulnerability of communities that drive people into the hands of the traffickers. We need to take approaches that look at the whole systems. We need to build resilient communities, and we absolutely need to centre workers and communities that we serve in our work. Civil society has come a long way in the last decade. I worry that state leadership has lagged. It's quite sad to me that with Prime Minister Theresa May stepping down, we don't have a national leader that puts a focus on slavery and trafficking at the centre of international efforts. It's really missed in the international fora like this. I'm particularly saddened by the fact that we don't have leaders from low and middle income countries taking a leadership approach here. We see such strong leadership on issues around climate and health and nutrition and migration from low and middle income countries, and it would make such a difference to have that leadership on the international stage when it comes to trafficking. And most importantly, we're seeing a shift towards centering survivor leadership and the leadership of those from the most impacted communities, but we have a long way to go. We talk a lot. I talk a lot. Other leaders talk a lot about survivor leadership, but we need to really show it in our actions. I'm delighted there's a panel tomorrow morning with some very eminent survivor leaders, but to be perfectly honest, they should be leading the panels today, and they should be speaking in these opening sessions. And I hope next year we'll have survivor leaders on this panel telling us what really makes a difference in tackling trafficking and slavery. So in a decade, we've seen huge progress in many ways, and much of it's deeply encouraging. But we're left with the very cold and stark fact that since we started measuring slavery a decade ago, our estimates have increased by 2/3, either through better measurement or an increase in trafficking, and most likely both, and we just don't know why. So we're not succeeding by any credible measure. I'm hopeful we can change those trends, particularly given our deeper knowledge and expertise and real progress in tackling forced labour in particular. But we won't do it without much more effective efforts from everyone here and everyone focused on this problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very sobering account of the global efforts to combat human trafficking. Well, self-critical account that we all, I think, can sign up to. Measuring the prevalence of human trafficking is something which, well, a lot has been happening, but when we have estimates in countries, sometimes the result is that there is fear that there will be no resources to actually look after the victims, which is probably stopping countries maybe even from engaging in the first place. So it is a vicious circle, which we unfortunately see. Now, I would like to turn to the next speaker who will be talking exactly about global figures, because this is what the UNODC is doing, the Global Trafficking in Persons report, is particularly the latest report which was published earlier this year. So I would like to introduce Angela May, who is the Chief of the Research and Trend Analysis Branch of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC. She has been responsible for the production and publication of various global research publications, in particular the Global Report on Trafficking in Persons, amongst others. And she will be talking to us about the data which the UNODC has produced, the trends, and the analysis, the impact for policy making. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, and thank you for inviting us and give us the opportunity to tell you about the results of our research, of global research on trafficking in person. Just to give you a background, we research all type of criminal markets, so not only trafficking in person. And so we have, in a way, the opportunity also to see some of the commonalities that the trafficking in person has with other crimes. And maybe the peculiarities also that there is in these forms of crime. But here I wanted to tell you, and many speakers before me spoke about the report. So this is the report. So I'll show you maybe graphically some of the findings that others have mentioned, and also giving you a little bit of more details on what you can find as a resource for your work in general. Just to tell you that, these data and findings are based on the largest data set that we have globally on trafficking person. All the numbers that have been mentioned, the millions, etc., are estimates. This is the data that relates to, 450,000 victims, and from where we can extrapolate and estimate a lot out of there, but that's the database that we have. And with also 300,000 suspects, so possible traffickers, and also we have we complement this quantitative analysis with qualitative information based on core cases, because that's where we find the stories, the story of the victims and the stories of the traffickers as well, to understand better, the patterns and dynamic of this crime. So maybe not. Okay, so just here to give you on the map the countries, this is based on data that we receive from member states, so from all of you in this table. And what we do is, as many of others mentioned earlier, this is a transnational crime. And so what the service, in a way that we give back to the member states, is to connect the dots. So to put together the information the countries bring in terms of how this crime actually connects across borders. Now I'll give you the here you see again visually what has been mentioned earlier, that for the first time here is the number of detected victims, is a ratio by population, and you see on the left side the trend that we are having over the years when we collected the data, and you see that for the first time during COVID, basically in 2020, we saw a decrease, 11% decrease. And I'll tell you later our interpretation of the results. Again, others have already spoken, but I think it's interesting to see particularly the details on the right, where I don't know how much you can read, but there is by sub-region, and the darker color are male victims and the lighter color are female victims. And you see that actually in some regions, the detected victims increase. And you may notice that all of those sub-regions where basically you see an increase are OSCE. So again, I don't know if you can read, but it's North America, Central and South and Eastern Europe, Western and Southern Europe, and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. That's the geographical determination that we use, but basically they are all all countries that are part of the OSCE. As Nick mentioned, these are, these are only the tip of the iceberg, are the victims that are detected. We know that the iceberg is much bigger. And indeed, but what we can collect globally so far are only this number, because only few countries yet have undertaken prevalence studies. Today, that we have the methodology, together with IOM, we have published a manual, so we have the global standards to produce prevalence studies that can help the countries to do it. The challenges that we have been seeing in implementing this methodology is actually privacy of data and the difficulties of exchanging data across institutions. So we have now the tools that we didn't have probably 5-10 years ago to do this, but there are some challenges that we need to overcome if we really want to estimate. And so that if you want in 10 years, we come back and we can have, as Nick mentioned, the power of measuring really when we know the trend of trafficking person, if all the countries really do the efforts to do these prevalence studies. So why did we see a decrease? And since this indicator is the number of detected victims, we know that this indicator is affected by two things. One is trend in trafficking, and the other one is the capacity of the state to identify the victims. And so we put together, and comfortably, based on the information that we collected through scientific research, but also a lot of information from member states, clearly what that reduction that we have seen, particularly during COVID, is mainly relating to the reduced capacity of states in detecting trafficking victims. There has also been a slightly, decrease probably of some forms of trafficking because of the reduced opportunities of traffickers with lockdowns. But clearly also the fact that some forms of trafficking have really even become more hidden and more difficult to identify. So in particular is the trafficking for sexual exploitation. If you see that there was an 11% decrease globally of detected victims in general, actually the decrease for sexual exploitation was even larger, with 24%. With some of the region that actually now in the OSCE actually seen a decrease also in sexual exploitation, and only North America seen an increase during 2021. Now, as again Nick mentioned earlier, clearly over the years the phenomenon of trafficking person has changed, and you can see here again if the number of detected victims cannot tell us exactly the total number of victims, is very helpful to analyze this data, to look at the patterns and to see how these patterns change. And you see that since we started analyzing and looking at the data in 2004, the majority basically they were women. And then girls, and then men and boy. You see how this has changed now visually in 2020 with many more men. And if you see on the right, that is the latest number in terms of the percentage of victims in terms of their forms of exploitation. And if in 2004, the great majority of the victims were for sexual exploitation, today we have basically almost the same share between forced labor and sexual exploitation. And also to be, it's interesting to particularly watch other forms that are emerging, like for example, 10% of victims exploited for criminal activities. So important really to see how this also different forms of exploitations are really changing very rapidly. Now, one of the findings, I tell you that really, in a way, were telling and surprising to us when we analyze the court cases, we ask ourselves, how do victims become identified by states? How do they come to the attention of the states? And here you see that for more than 40% of all the victims are actually come to the attention, are rescued by themselves. So the victim not only have the burden of being victim, but apparently also have the burden also to be rescued. Only about 30% are actually rescued by law enforcement, and others by the communities, by families. So really here this indicate how much more work is needed to strengthen national authorities and law enforcement authorities or other authorities to really rescue victims. Yes, here is in terms now the criminal justice response. So once the victims are identified, what happens to the traffickers? And this is, again, some of the speakers earlier mentioned it. And on the right side, you see there, in relative terms, how the convictions have been decreasing even before COVID globally. And it's striking, you see the line. During COVID, we have observed this declining trend also for other crimes. But the sharp decrease in trafficking is really more alarming. And here, is to show also the sub-regions that are relevant for the OSCE region. You see that only in Central and Western Europe there was an increase of convictions, while for all the other regions actually there's been a decrease, and in some cases even a decrease of almost 50%. Now, just wanted to glance through. There are a lot of more details that you can find in the But here I just wanted to zoom in some of the sub-region of the OSCE region, to talk about the flows. You know, we always have also an idea of trafficking, and definitely there is a big dynamics of large trafficking across regions and across countries. But as you can see, there are differences. And then just to give you an idea, from what you see here is from North America, then Central and Western Europe, then Eastern, Central Europe, and then Eastern and Central Asia. And the brownish size identify the outside region flows. And you see that clearly, I mean, not that is we didn't know before, but here you can see the extent to which this, you know, North America and Western Europe to be destination countries. And clearly, for example, particularly for Western, Southern Eastern Europe, the large proportion of victims have been identified coming from different regions. But what is interesting for the other region is that there is a lot of domestic, inter-regional, and also domestic trafficking. And it's something that really is important to highlight, because particularly in prevalence studies, in countries where the total number of victims have been identified, has been clear in almost all the studies that national victims are highly under identified. So national authority always have more, you know, going after those that come from different countries or a different region. Another thing that I wanted to highlight, just again to give you a flavor on what you can find in the report, is some of the peculiarity of these regions that you see in North America and Central Asia. And what we have analyzed from the trafficker side is to understand the typology of the traffickers. And if you see there on the left is on the global scale, you see that the percentage of traffickers, the greatest percentage of traffickers, in terms of victims, are business-like, what we call business-like type of organized crime. So those that are really interested and really focus on the business of trafficking. The other one, about 23% of the victims are trafficked by what we call governance type of organized crime. So those that are really large criminal groups that are involved typically in many other illicit markets. But then you see also that there are also individual traffickers that traffic their spouse, their partner, their children, for example. And why is very important to understand this? Going back to what Gary was talking about in the deterrence. And some of these groups are more sensitive than others of deterrence. And because, for example, the business type are definitely more, subject, and they can be probably be more affected by deterrence, while, for example, governance type of organized crime may not be that sensitive. So it's important to analyze, and as you can see, again, just as illustrative, to see how actually in North America there is a larger proportion, for example, of governance type of organized crime groups, while in Central Asia there is a predominantly type of business type organization that are related. Another peculiarity for this region is, for example, in Eastern Europe, as you have globally, the majority of victims remain women and girls. But you see that, for example, in Eastern Europe, the majority of the detected victim are actually men. And this is also in relation because of the form of trafficking that is most identified as forced labor. But it's also interesting from the trafficker's perspective that typically the highest number of the share of the traffic are male. But you see that, for example, in Central Asia, the greater percentage of traffickers are women. And I mean, it's interesting. I don't have the time to go into this, but there is an interesting research question to understand why. I want to conclude on something to show something that, again, many others have spoken, but again, I just wanted to show you graphically, and is the conflict and trafficking, and how much conflict affect also trafficking. First of all, the numbers, what the numbers say, if we look at, around the world and we say, where do we find victims that comes from conflict areas? The majority of these victims globally come from sub-Saharan Africa. But as many others have mentioned, the dimension of the refugee population or the people that are fleeing from Ukraine, that have flown from Ukraine, between 5 to 6 million, really also make this a larger threat. And on the right, I just wanted to show you a graph that map and show the relationship between asylum seeker and the victim detected from Ukraine. And this is based to show, if you see the blue bar are the refugees. And you see that after 2014, there was the previous conflict in Ukraine, there has been an increase, of course, of people seeking refugees in Europe. And the line that you see over the bars relates to the share of Ukrainian victims identified in Europe. And you clearly see there the correlation. And you see that how the increase in the number of refugees from Ukraine definitely increase also the size of the trafficking coming from Ukraine. So that is just a sign to say to remain vigilant, because that tells us that then if we overlay that, we were talking about in 2014 about 150,000 refugees. Now we are talking about millions. As others have said, with the provision of the European Union in giving legal status to these people, clearly make the threat less threatening, but definitely the size also tells us that we should continue to be vigilant. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Angela, for giving us a flavor of what is a much more comprehensive and very important report. Data which is fascinating and which opens a lot of questions and really calls for additional reflections on how to better target the policies and the actions that states and the international organizations take. Collecting data on human trafficking is challenging, as we know, because it comes from states. And at the national level, there is often missing methodology of how to collect it, divergences between countries. You know, who is a victim? How are victims counted? We see that with the 47 European countries where we collect data, that often it is not disaggregated, it is not comparable. So huge challenges. But very important work that you're doing. So the final speaker on this panel will also talk about data and analysis of data. And I would like to introduce to you Andrea Salvoni, who is currently the Deputy Coordinator of the Office of the OSCE Special Representative and Coordinator for Combating Human Trafficking. Andrea manages the daily operations of the office and supports the political engagement and programmatic activities of the office, including on research and policy development, capacity building, and technical assistance to OSCE participating states. So, Andrea, you will be talking about the most recent research, which really takes stock of the compliance with the obligations of the OSCE participating states. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Petya, and good afternoon, everybody. Indeed, I'll try to sum up today's discussion by presenting to you some of the findings of the survey we conducted, we published last year on action that OSCE participating states have taken on advancing and implementing OSCE anti-trafficking commitments. Now, I'll try in particular to focus on three key areas in my short, I promise you, presentation. The first bucket is around emerging trends and persistent challenges in combating trafficking. So what has emerged in our latest report? I should say we have conducted a similar report about 6 years prior to that. So what's interesting about the latest report is that it gives us an idea of the trends and some of the new forms of exploitation, as well as the forms of exploitation that have gained more prevalence across the OSCE region. The second bucket that I'll be briefly talking about to sort of introduce, help introduce tomorrow's discussion on panel 2 is around some of the systems and structures and the deficiencies that we've seen in the data around the systems and structures of states, so the architecture of states' anti-trafficking effort. In the third bucket, again, targeting another of tomorrow's panel, panel 3, will provide a short analysis on the policy and legislative gaps, as well as the policy areas that have seen a significant improvement in recent years. So on emerging trends in CTHB, I think the short way to summarize it is that people are getting exploited in new ways, and that often involves technology. You see some of the data points on screen. Let me highlight a couple of them for you. One of the most interesting, I think, is the significant increase in countries that have reported cases of exploitation in criminal activities, or forced criminality, as it's sometimes referred to. What it's even more interesting, perhaps, within this form of trafficking is that it accounted for 2% of all identified trafficking cases in 2015, and it accounts now for 24% of identified trafficking cases, from 2% to 24%. That's clearly a huge increase. Another point of strong of importance here is point C. We have just heard from Laila Mickelwait around pornography and trafficking for the purpose of porn production. This is a new form of trafficking. It was not detected in 2015. It's now detected in 56% of OSCE participating states. Let me quickly moving to the second bucket around the systems and structure, and to sort of preview some of the discussions tomorrow. It's clear there are barriers, and others before me have highlighted that there are clear barriers to identification of victims. Now, if 40%, and we just heard from Angela from UNODC, if 40% of victims come forward on their own and self-identified, you see that some of the numbers on screen pose a real challenge. If the majority of countries, only law enforcement can formally identify victims, and we've just heard from UNODC that 28% of victims, only 28% of victims are identified through law enforcement, that clearly poses a challenge. What we see is some resistance and some challenges to truly move to what we call a whole of society approach, whereby we look at combating trafficking as a more comprehensive effort of multiple agencies. So, for example, only 2 OSCE participating states allow labor inspectors to formally identify victims of trafficking. Now, Nick was earlier advocating for stronger attention to victims to trafficking for the purpose of labor exploitation. It's clear that we need to address some of these issues around labor inspectors' mandate in order to be able to do that. Another crucial topic when it comes to identification, Petya had mentioned that in her introductory remark to this panel, is around the decoupling of victim services to victims with their involvement in criminal proceedings. Only 29 OSCE participating states out of 57 allow that. As Petya was highlighting, this is a legal obligation under the Council of Europe Convention. It's an OSCE commitment as well. It's definitely an area where we collectively need to work more. There is a side event tomorrow at 1 in Ratzal on the 5th floor to talk about what we call the social path of identification. The idea of expanding the procedures to identify victims outside of law enforcement and criminal justice proceeding. The last point around the systems and structure is about trainings. The challenges to go to truly implement a whole of society approach is reflecting in the way we conduct anti-trafficking trainings. Few countries reported organizing cross-disciplinary trainings with personnel from a broad spectrum of professional backgrounds, so from the different agencies that we need to be engaging. Gary was mentioning earlier that deterrence work. That's exactly why we need to invest in it, and we need to equip agencies outside of the sort of usual suspect within law enforcement to help us do that. This is particularly true, for example, around financial investigation. Only 18 participating states staff train their staff on how to investigate THV offenses through financial means. And with that, I'll move to the third bucket in my presentation with the cooperation of the. There you go. Let me start with the good news. There are areas that have clearly seen positive development on the policy and legislative side. 48 OSCE participating states have specific criteria for identifying victims of trafficking, and that's reflected in their legislation. That's great. More interestingly, perhaps 85% of OSCE participating states do list trafficking as a predicate offense. If you combine this with the data point I just gave you earlier about the training for the financial sector, you clearly see that more often than not, that's not a policy problem. It's more of an implementation problem. And the last area I'd like to highlight in terms of positive trending, it was mentioned by several speakers before me, is around leveraging public procurement to combat labor exploitation in supply chains. The number of countries that reported having public procurement regulations compared to 6 years before doubled. That's a very significant improvement, and that's certainly something to celebrate. Now, after the good news comes the slightly less good news. One of the areas that we have identified as lagging behind in terms of policy action is around comprehensive and robust action to discourage the demand that fosters exploitation. That's a legal obligation of states as well as an OSCE commitment. This is true when it comes to labor exploitation. Only 16 countries out of 57 reported having laws requiring countries to to be transparent about the measures that they have taken in addressing labor exploitation in their supply chains. Even fewer have more robust laws around due diligence, and that's clearly an area. And we see some momentum. We'll be discussing tomorrow on panel 3. There clearly is momentum across the OSCE region. The EU is putting forward one of the most comprehensive and ambitious plan on that. Several countries, both within and outside the EU, have recently adopted important legislation. But the momentum is there, but we really need to capitalize on that. Similarly, on the sex exploitation side, 2 years ago, we published a comprehensive analysis on addressing demand that fosters sexual exploitation, and we could not find any single meaningful activity in 19 OSCE participating states to deter demand that fosters sexual exploitation. That's 33%, 1/3 of OSCE participating states, and 40% of OSCE participating states do not criminalize the knowing use, which is the sort of bare minimum. This is the criminalizing men who knowingly purchase sex from someone they know is a trafficking victim. 40% of OSCE participating states do not have that provision. The second area where clearly is policy is needed is around technology. Only 7 OSCE participating states make technology company criminally liable for knowingly facilitated trafficking, or then platform knowingly facilitated trafficking on their platform. Only 9 reported age verification to access to limit access to children to pornographic websites. We heard from Laila Mickelwait that the real fight here is on children being depicted on website. If we don't start from the easy wins like the one on screen right now, we are hardly gonna achieve the bigger one. This is another area that will be addressed tomorrow on panel 3. Finally, my last point trying to sum everything up. Eventually, there you go. Lady May earlier said that steady progress is not enough, which totally ruins my slide, because I was going to try to close with the good news, but clearly it's... So what I was going to say is that the OSCE survey highlights that there has been steady and yet somewhat slow progress. After Lady May's remarks, I will be insisting on the slow element. There are areas that have gained prominence and have seen policy action. Labor exploitation in public procurement, that's clearly a win. The overwhelming finding of the OSCE survey is that resource constraints hampers the effectiveness of anti-trafficking action. And the report highlights in particularly three areas, which are the areas I'll be leaving you with. Prevention activities, particularly targeting the demand side of the crime, need to be elevated and be more ambitious. Addressing technology-facilitated trafficking is an urgent need. This is where trafficking more and more takes place today. And finally, we need to allocate the adequate resources for anti-trafficking people on the ground to conduct their work, so that all the things we've heard from the speakers before me around deterrence, around victim services can be enacted on the ground. A positive practice that has emerged from the survey is the use of assets that have been confiscated from traffickers to directly support victim service and anti-trafficking activities. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll turn it over to Petya for to open the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Indeed, as you clearly showed us, it's a mixed picture. There are some good signs, but also things to worry about. And this is indeed what we see through the monitoring of the Council of Europe Anti-Trafficking Convention with its 48 state parties. We have seen in the last 7 years, in particular, an increase in labor trafficking, which has emerged as the predominant form of exploitation in a growing number of European countries, which is why last year the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe issued a new, very important recommendation on combating this form of trafficking, which looks also at the role of labor inspectors, labor markets, supply chains, corporate responsibility, the banking sector, etc. So we'll be looking at promoting the implementation of this recommendation in the coming years. Now, I would like to stress at the end of this, I'm very grateful to all the 5 speakers for their very important contributions and showing clear examples of leadership in different areas. Clearly, governments in the OSCE participating states have been faced sometimes with new challenges, competing challenges, and we see that there are tensions between the fight against irregular migration and human trafficking increasingly. So these competing challenges sometimes lead to less prioritization of the fight against human trafficking, less human and financial resources being allocated to it. So that is why we need, and this conference is really a triggering factor for this, we need new impetus, new impulse in order to maintain the level of each country's commitment to the fight against human trafficking. We need a clear political commitment to sustain our collective efforts and leadership to combat human trafficking. Now, I would like to start with the request for taking the floor. I have been given a list, and as Val said earlier today, please keep to the allocated time, which is in principle 2 minutes per speaker. We'll start with speakers who are in the room, and then there are some questions from participants who are online, and they have actually sent their questions in writing. I'll read them out. I would first like to invite the Deputy Minister of Labour, Social Security and Migration of the Republic of Kyrgyzstan, who is, I think, in the room, to take the floor. You have the floor, sir.
Добрый день, уважаемые участники. Я представляю Кыргызскую республику, Кыргызстан, являюсь заместителем министра труда, социального обеспечения и миграции. Кыргызской Республики, который является уполномоченным органом государственным по координации деятельности по предупреждению и борьбе с торговлей людьми. Мне очень приятно участвовать на 23-й сессии, на 23-й конференции Альянса по борьбе с торговлей людьми. Выражаю благодарность организациям данной конференции за предоставленную возможность выступить с докладом. Проблема торговли людьми продолжает оставаться актуальной для Кыргызской Республики, как и для всего мирового общества. И позвольте мне остановиться на проблемах в сфере борьбы с торговлей людьми, о достижениях, об инструментах, законах и политике Кыргызской Республики. Планирую выступить завтра на 3-й сессии конференции. Трудность торговли людьми составляет в том, что данное преступление является латентным и очень сложно отследить преступные действия. Проблема торговли людьми – это грубое нарушение прав человека. Это сложный международный вопрос, требующий сотрудничества между общественными организациями и заинтересованными сторонами. Эта проблема требует многомерного наблюдения, которое включает в себя профилактику, защиту жертв, преследование преступников и реабилитации жертв. Защита жертв включает в себе воздействие, это юридическая, медицинская помощь, а также защиту их прав и личных данных. Преследование преступников включает в себя правоприменительную работу и сотрудничество между сотрудничество и улучшение международного сотрудничества по экстрадиции преступников. Также важную роль играет реабилитация жертв, включает в себя это в помощь социальной адаптации, повышение самоуважения, самооценки, также в реинтеграции общества. Несмотря на высокую напряженность в борьбе с торговлей людьми, существует несколько недостающихся компонентов, которые могут помочь повысить эффективность. Это вот ранее перечисленные профилактическая работа, сотрудничество между странами, партнерами, защита жертв, прав жертв. И я бы хотела остановиться на тех проблемах, которые существуют в нашей стране. Несмотря на проводимую работу, существует ряд проблем. Это отсутствие реальной целостной системы предоставления помощи и защиты гражданам, пострадавшим от этого преступления, от идентификации жертв торговли людьми до предоставления услуг по реабилитации и реинтеграции. И недостаточность профессионального знания, потенциала для выявления, идентификации и перенаправления жертв торговли людьми. Недостаточная подготовка судей, прокуроров, сотрудников правоохранительных органов по аспектам современных методов расследования преступлений по торговле людьми. Также есть проблема недостаточности дезагрегированных сведений, данных о преступлениях по торговле людьми в официальных формах статистической отчетности, осуществление оценки расходов и затрат на реализацию мероприятий в сфере борьбы с торговлей людьми для рассмотрения при формировании бюджета. Для устранения выявленных проблем необходимо решить ряд задач, которые ориентированы на их преодоление. И в связи с чем в апреле 2022 года была принята программа по борьбе с торговлей людьми в Кыргызской Республике на 2022-2025 годы. И в завершении своего выступления хочу сказать, что в Кыргызской Республике будет усилен контроль за ходом реализации выполнения плана мероприятий, будет проведен мониторинг оценка, привлечение донорской помощи и расширение практики государственно-социального заказа по оказанию социальной помощи, социальной услуги жертвам торговли людьми. И разрешите на этом пожелать всем нам продуктивной, конструктивной работы. Благодарю за внимание.
Спасибо вам тоже. I would like to remind you, everyone, about the limitations on the time, and clearly it's an additional added values that you have now a national rapporteur on trafficking that we'll hear tomorrow from the Republic of Kyrgyzstan. I would like now to ask the delegation of Canada, Miss Michelle van de Bogart, who I suppose is in the room. Please, you have the floor.
Merci. Excellences, distingués invités, chers collègues, permettez-moi tout d'abord de remercier l'OSCE d'avoir organisé ce toujours utile événement. Nous nous rencontrons quelques semaines après le triste premier anniversaire de l'invasion de l'Ukraine par Vladimir Poutine. Selon le dernier rapport mondial sur la traite des personnes de l'ONUDC, lorsque Poutine a illégalement annexé la Crimée en 2014, les cas de traite des personnes ont quadruplé en Ukraine en raison des conséquences de ce conflit. Nous ne pouvons qu'estimer malheureusement que le nombre de victimes nous continuera d'exploser dans les années à venir à cause de cette guerre injustifiable en Europe. Le Canada condamne fermement l'agression illégale et non provoquée de Vladimir Poutine contre l'Ukraine et reste solidaire des peuples ukrainiens. Mr. Chair, related to this panel's topic on trends, patterns, and leadership, Canada would like to share findings from an innovative analysis conducted by the Financial Transaction and Report Analysis Centre of Canada, commonly known as FinTrack. In addition to its work on Project Protect, a unique private-public sector partnership that targets human trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation by focusing on the money laundering aspect of the crime, FinTrack analyzed human trafficking corridors in Canada, which are strips of land or routes that traffickers use to move victims between sites of exploitation or across different jurisdictions. From this analysis, FinTrack used detailed financial intelligence to identify and corroborate the existence of routes associated with suspected human trafficking-related activity. We hope that this analysis of financial criminal behaviors reliant on these corridors will help law enforcement to identify, detect, and disrupt criminal activities. This analysis also found significant commingling of proceeds of crime, largely from drug and weapon trafficking, which is indicative of continued efforts by organized crime groups to diversify their illicit income streams and expand their profits. It should also be mentioned that similar information on human trafficking corridors in Canada has also been recently published by the civil society organization called Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking, who delivers Canada's human trafficking hotline. Canadian public and private partners will continue to leverage data analysis and the work done at FinTrack to combat human trafficking in Canada and abroad. We would be happy to share more on this partnership model and findings with other delegations. Thank you. Merci.
Oui, je vous remercie pour ces informations très intéressantes. Now I would like to give the floor to the delegation of the United States, Ambassador Dyer.
The United States thanks the panelists for this informative discussion, and we would like to make just a couple of important topics. One is in our 2022 Trafficking in Persons report, which was released last summer, we noted some positive trends among various OSCE participating states, including increasing victim protection efforts and funding. However, several concerns were noted that must be addressed. For example, prosecutors, judges, and investigators lack familiarity with victim-centered and trauma-informed approaches, which can subject victims to further trauma and re-victimization. We additionally must meaningfully engage survivors by incorporating their input and establish mechanisms for providing compensation to them. I also want to draw attention to an alarming new trend, which is forced criminality in cyber scam operations occurring in parts of Southeast Asia. involving victims from around the world in conditions of forced labor, including from the OSCE region. The U.S. government is deeply concerned by the proliferation of these scam operations, which are run by organized criminal actors. We are specifically grateful for the work of civil society organizations worldwide, including the International Justice Mission, for documenting this new form of human trafficking. And finally, the United States is deeply concerned about the many ways that Russia's war in Ukraine is increasing trafficking risks. We are specifically concerned by reports of Russia's forced relocation of Ukraine's children. Information is limited, and we do not currently have enough data to know whether these children are being exploited. However, we call on Russia to halt all deportations of Ukraine's children and to reunite those it has already deported with their families or legal guardians in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. The next request for the floor is from the Russian Federation Deputy Director Nikolai Kalashnikov. You have the floor.
Спасибо, госпожа председатель. Уважаемые коллеги, хотел бы сначала выразить слова благодарности нашим панелистам. Во многом спорно, конечно, многие пассажи, но очень интересно. Учтем. С учетом регламента зачитаю краткую версию выступления. Полный текст будет распространен через секретариат ОБСЕ. Российская Федерация всегда рассматривала эффективное противодействие торговле людьми и связанные с ней вызовы в качестве приоритетной задачи, стоящей перед мировым сообществом. Убеждены, что именно на государстве, а конкретно на профильных национальных структурах, лежит основная ответственность по защите своих граждан, в том числе перед лицом данной угрозы. Не менее важно межгосударственное сотрудничество, как на двусторонней, так и на многосторонней основе. Наша страна на системной основе поддерживает международные усилия по борьбе с торговлей людьми при главенствующей роли ООН. Рассматриваем работу под эгидой офиса спецпредставителя и координатора ОБСЕ по борьбе с торговлей людьми, в частности, конференции Альянса, как важное направление, необходимое для обмена мнениями и дальнейшего продвижения в этой области. Полагаем, что такими возможностями ОБСЕ нужно правильно распоряжаться и призываем всех коллег к профессиональной, деполитизированной дискуссии и обмену полезным опытом. Это, кстати, касается и попыток навязывания государством неизвестной многим из них концепции выживших. Российская Федерация всегда подчеркивала важность борьбы с первопричинами трафикинга. Крайне важным представляется именно предотвращение попадания людей в ситуации, которые могут привести их в руки преступников. Обращаем внимание, что в числе одного из самых латентных видов трафикинга остается торговля людьми в целях извлечения органов, клеток и тканей человека. Это серьезный вызов для всех нас. Мы рекомендуем обратить на это более пристальное внимание. В ряде стран, несмотря на многочисленные сообщения СМИ, а также доклады международных организаций, власти, совершенно никого не стесняясь, заявляют, что им ничего не известно о таких случаях. Что это, если не сокрытие преступности на самом высоком уровне? Убеждены, что все подобные дела требуют незамедлительного и тщательного расследования. Рассчитываем, что офис спецпредставителя продолжит держать эту проблематику в фокусе своего внимания. Ну и в завершение, широко известно, что современные технологии, прежде всего сеть интернет, активно используются отдельными преступниками и организованными криминальными группировками, занимающимися торговлей живым товаром. Так называемый теневой интернет является проблемой для всех без исключения стран. Однако, к сожалению, вредоносный контент размещается и в открытой его части. Мы сегодня об этом много слышали. В социальных сетях. Все подобные случаи требуют незамедлительной реакции компетентных органов власти, блокировки соответствующих сайтов и страниц, поиска и наказания виновных. Спасибо за внимание.
Спасибо вам тоже. The next request for the floor is from the Holy See. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. Given the time constraints, I will read a shorter version of the statement. Human trafficking remains one of the most complex phenomena to address. Given its complexity and the low visibility in which it takes place, trafficking in persons and their exploitation remain unknown to most. Furthermore, this phenomenon has almost become a condition for economic progress in many of our societies. In fact, the exploitation of those trafficked is cross-cutting among many productive sectors of our societies, such as agriculture, food production, electronics, construction, manufacturing, and tourism, hospitality, and domestic work. One of the most coercive forms of human trafficking, sexual exploitation, is perhaps the most familiar and the most fought against through the provision of different forms of protection and assistance to the victims. In addressing the nature of this phenomenon more generally, one needs to go to the very heart of the problem by taking into account and understanding the underlying reasons why thousands of women and men end up exploited by criminal organizations. All too often, these people want to flee their territory or their countries at all costs. In their search for a safer and more decent life, they are easily taken advantage of by traffickers which promise to help them escape from poverty, war, and persecution, as well as in hospitable territories affected by natural and climatic events. The complexity of trafficking in human beings requires a multidimensional and multi-actor response that should be coordinated at the national, regional, and international levels. Unfortunately, this does not happen enough, and the consequences are before our eyes. Pope Francis emphasized there is a need to overcome indifference and to reject the idea that migrants are a problem for others. The results of this approach are evident in the dehumanization of those migrants concentrated in hotspots where they end up as easy prey to organized crime and human traffickers, or engage in desperate attempts to escape that at times end in death. Sadly, we must also note that migrants are themselves often turned into a weapon of political blackmail, becoming a sort of bargaining commodity that deprives them of their dignity. Therefore, it is increasingly urgent to take a more holistic approach to this phenomenon, which is in constant transformation within a rapidly changing world. Thank you very much.
Thank you as well. A request from the floor from Sweden on behalf of the European Union. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. With your permission, I will pass the floor to the delegation of the European Union.
Madam Moderator, thank you and good afternoon. I would like to start by thanking the speakers for their insightful contributions and for highlighting the nature and scale of trafficking in human beings and exploitation. 20 years after the OSCE action plan to combat trafficking in human beings and the creation of a mandate of a special representative and coordinator, we must acknowledge that progress has been slow, as Andrea Salvoni also highlighted, but important challenges and gaps remain, and strong leadership is necessary to overcome them. We would also like to take this opportunity to commend the work of the Office of a Special Representative and Coordinator for Trafficking in Human Beings. Your office has been a leading voice in the fight against trafficking in human beings. Last year, the alliance took place against the backdrop of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, a war which has resulted in the largest refugee crisis in Europe since the Second World War. Sadly, now, more than 1 year later, Russia still rages its war and the Ukrainian people continue to face incredible hardships. Millions of people in Ukraine have been forced to flee their country or have been internally displaced. Currently, there are 8 million Ukrainians residing in EU member states, while 5.4 million are still internally displaced within Ukraine. Thousands have been illegally deported to Russia, among them many children. The European Union and its member states continue to provide those fleeing the war with food, shelter, access to health services, education, and the labor market. We would like to once again commend the work of the Office of a Special Representative for providing participating states with timely recommendations to mitigate the risk of human trafficking offline and online, stemming from the flow of refugees coming from Ukraine. Moreover, the launch of a Be Safe campaign has further reinforced protection and prevention by providing information to those at risk. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine puts the lives and safety of civilians at risk, especially women and children, who are particularly vulnerable to human rights abuses. It is of utmost importance to protect them against gender-based violence and trafficking, as well as other forms of exploitation, as required by international humanitarian law. We're extremely concerned that multiple reports, including those under the Moscow Mechanism, ODIHR, and the United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry, have indicated that Russia has illegally deported Ukrainian children from Ukraine to the Russian Federation. We are awaiting the report of a mission of experts under the Moscow Mechanism, recently invoked by 45 participating states, including all EU member states, for further information on the illegal deportation of children. Trafficking in human beings destroys individuals' lives by depriving people of their dignity, freedom, and fundamental rights. It is often a violent crime committed by organized crime networks. It should have no place in today's society. Yet trafficking in human beings is a global phenomenon. It happens in every country, in every region. It continues to happen in the European Union too. As shown in the fourth report on the progress made in the fight against trafficking in human beings within the European Union, there has also been a decrease in the number of registered victims during the pandemic, with the actual number of victims likely to be significantly higher. Despite an overall increase, the absolute number of prosecutions and convictions remains low, especially as compared to the number of registered victims and of suspects. The proliferation of online trafficking is another grave concern. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, criminal networks and traffickers have increased their presence and activities online. The expansion of digital technologies and the increased use of digital spaces has made it easier for traffickers to target their victims, especially those who are most vulnerable. And finally, trafficking in human beings remains a crime with a significant gender dimension. Women and girls represent 61% of all registered victims in the European Union in 2021. However, the share of male victims remains high at 28%. 59% of the victims were EU citizens and 40% had non-EU citizenship. Almost 1 in 4 victims of trafficking is a child. As a result, applying a human rights-based, victim-centered, and gender-sensitive and age-specific approach is essential. I thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you as well. There's one last request for the floor from those of you who are present in the room from the organization Liberanos, Scale Up. You have the floor. Please keep to the 2 minutes. Then I will read out the questions that were received online.
Thank you for giving me the floor, and I will respect the 2 minutes. I am the founder of Scale Up. This initiative proposes and promotes action on scaling up. How much do we need to spend? This is one of the first questions to ask, and nobody asks it. To give you some idea to consider, we spend about $1 billion a year against human trafficking compared to 40 on drug trafficking. Second figures, we need to address root causes. And as you know, fighting extreme poverty is the most important action, but the most effective. According to Jeffrey Sachs, we need to spend $175 billion per year over the next 20 years to reduce extreme poverty. So I would like you to consider whether the next step is to spend $1 billion or $175 billion if we really want to address this issue. Now, how? Is it realistic? What is possible? A good example of scaling up strategy is the first mover coalition led by John Kerry with 800 global companies. There is $450 billion per year to fight carbon emission. This shows that scaling up is possible. We have identified with our team 10 key dimensions to address. I don't have time today to go through all of them, but you can download and right now a presentation of our strategy from our website, scale-up-initiative.org. I repeat, it works. We tried it before, scale-up-initiative.org. To conclude, scaling up must be our highest priority. Then the business has a critical role to play. Third, we invite you to join us to discuss ideas, to promote ideas in order to achieve the scaling up strategy. Thank you.
Thank you as well, Monsieur Mallet. Now, with this, the requests for the floor from the room have been exhausted, and I will read maybe 2 questions at a time, so that some of them are actually address the concrete speakers, so that you can reflect while the first question is being answered. So one question online comes from Expat USA, and it is addressed to Gary, I think, if he's still online. Should or how can the justice system be used to deter demand for sex trafficking victims? Please focus on utilizing public data, identifying online bias. And then there is a question for the Freedom Fund, for Nick. Most consumers do not know which of the products that they buy were produced with forced or slave labor. How do we get that information into the hands of the consumers prior to their purchase decisions? So these are the first 2 questions. So if Gary is online, I would like to invite you to take the floor.
Yes, please. Thank you. Excellent question about demand. In our work with the Philippine government and also with our work out of our hub in Romania addressing trafficking across Europe, we definitely found that as we were pursuing authorities seeking accountability for demand users, we actually then found connection to further perpetrators and criminal networks. And so that's a very rich mine to pursue to get further accountability. I think the larger question that we're looking at here together is, at some point, we all need to back up and ask, what will actually reduce the amount of trafficking the fastest as a global tragedy? I remember so well the HIV crisis as it emerged in the 90s. Every country had an HIV/AIDS problem and had to address it. But over time, if you step back and look at the global tragedy, you found that there were certain countries where it was focused and located and certain kinds of transmissions that could actually be stopped. Similarly with trafficking, if we look at it as a global phenomenon, as Nick was saying, forced labor is actually the largest proportion of it. And there's certain places in the world where that is going on with impunity. And the data now is showing that one thing really works fastest, and that is to be able to deter the traffickers. Just this year out of South Asia, a large state of more than 70 million people where 1/3 of manual laborers were working in forced labor, that has been reduced by 82% by that state government in a relatively short amount of years. We now know what works, and I do think we need to take on all of the complexities, but also begin to focus and invest in the things we now know work fastest and at scale. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Gary. Nick, I already read out the question, so please, you have the floor.
Sure. I'm a big believer in educating consumers and giving them the information so they can make the choices that they want to. But let's be clear, the primary obligation should be on corporates to ensure that there isn't forced labor in their supply chain. At the moment, we often don't have enough information to give to consumers. I mean, we don't know if our fast fashion was produced with forced labor or not. It often passes through the hands of 5, 6, 7 organizations. So it's very, very difficult to say to a consumer that the obligation is on them to make the choice. But companies are in a position to to provide that information or to dig down and ensure that they are identified in their supply chains. But of course, companies often benefit from forced labor. It lowers the costs of labor in their supply chain. If it lowers their costs, it increases their margin. So we need to identify ways to change that cost-benefit analysis, which is why at the Freedom Fund, we're a big believer in efforts around corporate accountability and the EU legislation around mandatory human rights due diligence to ensure that that information is more broadly available.
Yes, thank you, Nick. We in Europe we do look forward to the new EU legislation very much. Now, there's a question for Laila. I will read it out, and then a couple of questions for Angela. I'll also read them out so you can prepare, Angela. To Laila, I don't know who put the question, but the question is, how can Pornhub verify user identity and consent if they're not the ones who upload the videos? And then for Angela, one of the questions was about the limitations in detection which are attributed to privacy concerns. How can the private sector enhance collaboration between organizations in all sectors if there are these concerns about stringent privacy laws? This is one question. And the second one to you, Angela, is you mentioned the decrease in the detection of trafficking victims over the last years. Could this be explained by a reduction in the opportunities for traffickers to operate? And could you please elaborate more, namely on the forms of trafficking and exploitation that could have been impacted by this reduction of opportunities, and what factors influence this? I
believe Laila is not.
Laila is no longer with us, so
I'm here.
About that. No. Oh, she's sorry. Oh. I was given wrong information. You have the floor, please.
That's okay. No problem. Yes. So, sites like Pornhub and other user-generated pornographic sites have a responsibility to ensure that those that are in their videos, that they highly monetize with ads, with premium memberships, with data collection and direct sales, are consenting adults. They have the ability to do this. The technology is widely available for them to do this. It is used in other industries. Gambling, the financial sector, uses identification, verification. There's biometric scanning that can accompany that as well. And it's not a novel idea that the pornographic industry should be verifying ID and age for those in the videos that they allow to be distributed and monetized on their sites. The brick and mortar porn industry has had age and consent verification requirements since 1988 in the form of USC 2257, which demanded age verification and record keeping because it was understood, and it's still understood, that without this, the industry will be awash with child abuse and other forms of non-consensual illegal content. So it is possible, it is necessary, and it must be done. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Laila. Now, Angela, you have the floor for your responses.
Yeah, apology, I haven't understood probably correctly the question on privacy, but I will interpret it in the way I understood it, and apology for those that pose the question if that's not the right angle that you expect. But one issue that relates to data privacy is in undertaking prevalence studies. So prevalence studies are studies that basically use a statistical methodology to estimate the total number of trafficking victims, including those that are not coming to the attention of the authorities. How do these methodologies work? Is that basically they work with different lists of victims, and the overlapping of people in those lists allows statistics to estimate how many we don't see. The issue is that to do this overlapping, institutions need to share individual information, because you need to understand, for example, that the same victims is in two lists. Could be of NGOs, could be list of authorities, could be list in law enforcement. And where there has been the biggest challenge, at least that we have observed in member states in implementing these methodologies, is that private data privacy laws do not allow the sharing of this list. And so the question is, of course, we are all for data privacy, but can each country identify a trusted institution, like, for example, national statistical offices, or really offices that can be trusted that by law have to maintain the confidentiality? So again, I don't know if the question was relating to this, but indeed there is an issue of the data privacy that limits, in a way, the data that we can obtain on the number of the real number of victims. On the opportunities, I think is a good question. Indeed, when we see the number of victims identified going down, that was the first question that we asked. Is it because we had less trafficking because of COVID restrictions? And that's why we dig in. And indeed, there could be some forms of trafficking. And the one that comes to all of us in mind is sexual exploitation, because with the closing and the lockdowns, there were definitely less victims in the street for sexual exploitation. But what we have seen, there is also in the report, I haven't shown in my slide, an analysis that we have done on where is trafficking happening. And where particularly is trafficking for sexual exploitation happening? Is it in the street, in clubs, in pubs, in private houses? And what we have seen, indications that actually during COVID, sexual exploitation moved from the street to private houses, for example. So we could have seen less, but this does not mean that there was probably less opportunities, as you mentioned in the question. But we have a big question, and a research question for those of you that are interested, is because of the movement of the COVID, and at least is a question that we ask ourselves, is has the demand for sexual exploitation reduced during COVID? Or that demand has been supplied through different ways? I think that's a question that can inform all of us that we are talking about addressing demand, and to see whether, there is, what is that if it has reduced, what are the elements that then can be reduced more permanently? We see in all, as I was mentioning to you, other type of crime where we have markets. And we always talk about illicit markets where you have a demand and you have a supply. What we always see is that supply can relatively be reduced in shorter time. Demand, because it's relating to culture, is not only demand for trafficking services, is demand, think about drug use, think about other things. It takes much longer time to change.
Thank you very much, Angela, for your replies. Now, it is 6 p.m. sharp, and we have to respect the interpreters' working time. There's one question which is really general. I'm not sure who could answer it. It is linked to what you were saying about supply, and actually one of those who wrote online is talking about information trends observed in some countries about trafficking organizations which are state-sponsored, such as those running massage parlors and supplying victims of trafficking for such exploitation, state-sponsored. And the question, which is very largely put, have you noticed such trend in other jurisdictions? But I'm not sure that any of the speakers could be answering this now, so I'm just leaving it for reflection, and maybe tomorrow someone could address it. So with this, I would like to thank, first of all the speakers, panelists online and in the room for their extremely valuable contribution today. Thank you very much. Thanks to all the participants for their attention and also for taking the floor. And I would like to invite all of you to the reception which is being offered by the OSCE just outside the conference room. And see you tomorrow.